بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. يا ربنا زدنا علما وتقوى وبارك في أوقاتنا وفي أقوالنا وفي أفعالنا ولا تأخذنا بذنوبنا بل بارك فينا وفي أعمالنا. ونستغفرك ونتوب إليك والعصر إن الإنسان في خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. We wanted to focus a little on the whole concept of reimagining community and belonging. And then within that context, we talk about the problem of vision, leadership, and commitment, and the reality of the community. Right, and the single mothers and youth as case studies for kind of understanding how to reimagine the community. One of the things that we have to ask ourselves, firstly, is do we properly understand what community is in Islam? We can't assume that we understand what community is. And secondly, what is the ruling in the deen, in the sharia, with regard to building community? There is a certain type of commitment that comes with having understanding of the deen or believing in Islam. Let's stop at that point. When we testify the shahada has certain implications in it. To pledge to Allah wa ta'ala and believing in the oneness of Allah and believing in prophethood, specifically the prophethood of Muhammad bin Abdullah alayhi salatu wasalam. There are some commitments that come out of that pledge. Those commitments come out of understanding that shahada or that pledge is talking to us about having to know who Allah wa ta'ala is, having to know who the Prophet is, and what are the rights of Allah wa ta'ala and the Messenger upon us. That type of knowledge is rooted in the whole concept of believing in revelation. And believing in revelation, what flows out of that is believing in the Quran. And what flows out of believing in the Quran is believing in the Sunnah as a consequence of believing in the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam as an actual historical living human being that existed and communicated to us how to understand and implement the Quran in teaching and in modeling. And so then there is an implication in the teachings of the deen when we go back to the Quran. And the implication is that we have an understanding of ourselves, of our identity as Muslims. A lot of people talk about the issue of understanding the fundamentals of Aqidah, but there are other aspects of Aqidah or what we believe in that a lot of times are left out, that pertain to who we are as Muslims. And part of understanding who we are as Muslims, and this is probably one of the most detrimental issues, is the Muslim, on average, is not going to waver or alter the belief in the concept of the oneness of Allah wa ta'ala, even if there's some aspects of that are not properly understood. There's a general tendency for the Muslims to have a working knowledge of what Tawheed means. But what's more problematic is that many of us don't have an understanding of who we are in light of Islam, in light of the teachings of revelation. And so we have conceptions about ourselves as human beings and our relationship to the world and to each other that a lot of times are not Islamic. And this is where we're taken by the storm, so to speak. And so a fundamental aspect of Iman is community. You can't get around it. There's too many ayat of the Quran that the indications or the dalalat or dilalat or dulalat, however you want to say it, all of them are indicating to the fact that the Muslim is in relation to, right? That the Muslim submits to Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala. So there's submission in relation to Allah. That the Muslim is the brother of another Muslim. So there's a relationship there between a Muslim and other Muslims. And so there's rights and responsibilities that come from them. Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullahi alayhi, حينما كان يعرف في الفقه, when he defined the fiqh, or what's attributed to his teachings, he talked about the fiqh being fiqh al-akbar wa fiqh al-awsat wa fiqh al-asgar. That fiqh breaks up into a number of different categorizations. And so he said that fiqh is that knowledge, right, of who Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala is. And fiqh is a knowledge of the spiritual engagement that we have to have with ourselves. Tazkiyat an-nafs, or purification of the self. And that fiqh is understanding what we owe and what we are owed, right? In other words, what are the rights that others have over us and what rights do we have? And that pretty much summarizes the core of the deen, or the sharia. And so that in that understanding, even when you start talking about the issue of classifying the sharia into rights, haqqullah wa haqqul ibad, or al-huquq ammatan, there's no way that you can develop an understanding of the Muslim identity and self as being an isolated atom from anyone else. And this is one of the teachings which has come in to neglect or corruption, or it has come into the issue of misunderstanding, or the issue of lack of priority, right? And that's the issue of the community of the believers, right? If we see in the ayah of the Quran, إِنَّمَا الْمُؤْمِنِينَ إِخْوَةً, right, that tied into Iman is the reality of brotherhood, right? And that's where the emphasis. And then we have the hadith, لا يؤمن أحدكم حتى يحب لأخيه ما يحب لنفسه. That none of you, your faith is not, or your Iman is not complete until you love for your brother what you love for yourself. And so the context even of what love is, and what it is that you should love for yourself, and what it is that it means to love your brother, all of that is not something which is subject to the issue of emotion. It's something which is known in the deen, right? And so the issue of values that come in the deen, like not lying to your brother, like not deceiving your brother, like keeping your oaths and promises. Even we have whole chapters in fiqh. Fiqh in this sense, meaning in the books of fiqh, in the books that explicate the teachings of the Quran and the Sunnah. We have whole chapters which have to do with the issue of how you deal with an oath. How do you deal with contractual agreements that you make? And so there's so many different aspects that go into understanding the persona of the Muslim. But in those aspects that go into understanding the persona of the Muslim, which are really clarified when we have a solid, well-rounded understanding of the deen in its different dimensions. And when we look at the teachings of the ulama, we begin to understand the centrality of community. Even when you look at a book like Aqidah Tahawiyya, when you look at the whole issue of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, the whole concept of what the Jama'ah is, right? Or the whole concept of the ayah of the Quran, ittasimu bihablillahi jami'an. What is the habl of Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala? What is sometimes translated as the rope of Allah, but the meaning is not sufficient in English. Sometimes you find that the ulama say that the habl of Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala is tawheed. Sometimes they say that it's the Quran. Sometimes they say that it's the Jama'ah. So we have a number of different ayat and hadith and teachings, sayings of the ulama that all indicate to the issue of communal existence. اتصموا بحبل الله. And so if we talk about the whole issue of the command to hold firm, what are we talking about holding firm to? So we find that there's no ما في تعرض في هذه المعاني الثلاثة. There's no contradiction between all of those three meanings when the Quran is telling us to hold firm to Tawheed, to hold firm to the Quran, to hold firm to the community. And so that's, and we have other ayat, ta'awunu ala al-birri wa taqwa wa la ta'awunu ala al-ithmi wal udwan. How can we cooperate with each other? The Quran is commanding us. Here, this is sighat al-amr. The Quran is coming in the form of a command, telling us to cooperate with each other under certain principles. Al-birri wa taqwa, the fundamentals of the deen, are mentioned after us being told to. Taqwa is, in one definition of the ulama, is to implement that which is fundamental in the Sharia from the awamir, and from that which Allah tabarak wa ta'ala commands, and from that which Allah tabarak wa ta'ala prohibits, from that which is manhi anhu. And so then you have taqwa comes after us being told to, to exert ourselves, in all of that which is good, to cooperate in all of that which is good beyond the basics, beyond just the basics. And so, for instance, if that is the case, to go beyond the basics, the command here is encompassing individual responsibilities and collective responsibilities and the adab which comes along with that. And so there's no way that we can atomize or individualize the Muslim to the point where it's about you and yourself. And so that's the first thing, to have a proper framework to understand the whole concept of community. And so the issue of belonging, we have this assumption that once we take the shahada, we belong. Right? And that's what we say, that you take the shahada, that you have the shahada, and that initiates you into the ummah. But the feeling of belonging is a lot of times what's missing. And so that's why we say the issue of reimagining community and belonging. And the issue of belonging, we can go into a whole discussion on that for the rest of the night. But we have to pause on that reality, other than to say that technically speaking, everyone that takes the shahada belongs. But the reality of the situation is that everybody that has the shahada may not feel like they belong. And it's not just the issue of a person not having the right feelings. There's something that's missing in our interactions with each other, which come back to the issue of khuluq and suluk, comes back to the issue of our character and the way that we conduct ourselves. That gives this impression that we don't care, and that creates an environment in which people don't belong, that people don't have a sense of being committed to one another. Right? That in itself is a struggle. We find that the Prophet ﷺ, if we look and we examine the life of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, and also the lives of the companions, radiallahu anhum ajmain, we look at different periods of time, and sometimes what becomes manifest or is noticeable in the history of Islam in the earliest of generations is that the Prophet ﷺ will take time to forge relationships between different groups of people. And so the Muslim was never looked at as just a person that comes into the deen on their own. Even the whole concept of marriage is bringing someone from a collective situation into another collective situation. And there was also the concept of adopting people into the tribe. And so nowhere do we see in the history of Islam, especially in the earliest phase, is that people are carrying out their commitment to Allah wa ta'ala alone. And so that's the issue of belonging, that there's the reality of belonging with regard to taking the shahada or having the shahada, to taking the pledge that confesses that we're Muslim. And then there's the issue of feeling. And that varies from place to place, and community to community, and tribe to tribe, and family to family. It varies environmentally, and it varies in interaction. But when we start talking about the issue of the problem of vision, the problem of vision is that as of now, we have not understood ourselves as a collective that has certain obligations that are the obligations that we owe to others, and that there are certain obligations that are owed to us. When we talk about the concept of community as a whole, and we can figure that within that the whole concept of the centrality of the masjid. Because this is another factor that when we start talking about building community, if we talk about the prophetic inspiration, meaning the example of the sunnah inspiring us, right? The example of the sunnah as being revelation, which inspires us to action. Where do we get our momentum from, and our motivation from, and what objectives are we aiming at, and where do we get a sense of orientation from? The shahada predicates upon us, or the shahada makes clear for us and obligates us to come back to the issue of the sunnah or the prophetic example. And so again, we come back to the issue that the issue of vision. And we come back to the issue that the vision that we have of ourselves, flowing out of the idea of community, flowing out of the idea of centrality of the masjid, the idea that we have of the role of the masjid, which is part of the vision of ourselves, is one which is not in sync, is not in conformity with what we find in the book and the sunnah with regard to how to build community. Right? And this is why we're finding ourselves in a lot of difficulty. We can't just have vision that we invent for ourselves. And that's where, that's where we said Reimagining Community and Belonging, the problem of vision, leadership, and commitment, and the reality of the community. Right? There's the issue of what should be the case, and then what is the case, and then how do those two realities come together? What should be the case is that we should have a solid vision. And what should be the case with regard to that vision is that vision is grounded in prophetic teaching. So that what is between us in that vision is a contractual agreement to implement the deen. Right? It gives us a sense of self. And then there's a leadership that has an understanding of that vision, upholds that vision. It can't just be an intellectual reality. It has to be a reality which is represented in real time. And people are responsible and accountable for that. Right? And so we find many ahadith which talk about the importance of leadership. And so the issue of management and the issue of leadership, it has to be understood properly. Many people, what they're doing is managing buildings which the Muslims come together as a collective for specific occasions, whether those occasions are Salah, or those occasions are Jummah, or those occasions are Eid, or the Salatul Janazah, or Aqd Nikah. Those are occasions which people come. But the spirit of the community, we find that a lot of times it lacks. So there has to be a leadership which organizes that. And so that vision has to be properly understood with the leadership that organizes that and declares publicly to the community that we are fulfilling this task and this responsibility that we're obligated in the deen. And that we're obligated in the deen to fulfill. And that task and that responsibility is organizing the affairs of the Muslims so that their individual identity as a Muslim can be maintained in the context of their communal and collective identity, meaning that they belong to a jama'ah, they belong to a community. And so, we mention that point because then everyone has a commitment. The leadership is supposed to be committed to look after the affairs of the people, and the people are in a commitment to uphold the leadership as long as what is contractual is in place, which is maintaining the reality or the values and the principles and the obligations of the deen. And this is where there's a lot of failure. That people like the leadership position, but they don't like the accountability. And then people like the accountability to be able to make people accountable, in other words, but they don't like to be led. And so it's somewhat of a chaotic relationship that exists at the moment. And so that has to take into consideration the reality of the community. The vision, the leadership has to, before we get to the commitment, if we're going to talk about vision and leadership, we have to also study what's going on. That brings us to the 2 case studies as examples of commitment to the community and how it's 2 ways. When we talk about the case study, it needs to be developed further. But this is something that I'm gathering from the community itself in interacting with the community and listening. For instance, if we take the case of single mothers, if we were to really consider that the leadership, say for instance, the leadership of the masajid, let's keep us within the paradigm that we're working out of. If we say that the leadership has responsibilities to uphold the deen, then one of those responsibilities is the issue of collecting the zakat. And one of those issues is distributing the zakat and even the sadaqah. So then, implied in that is that the leadership is aware of the conditions of the people to such an extent that the distribution of the sadaqah and the zakat being obligatory, the sadaqah being that which is given from the well-wishing of the Muslims for others, there should be some understanding then that because there's a differentiation between the zakat and sadaqah. The zakat, whether it's fitr or whether it's zakatul mal, is a right of the poor. Again, we go back to the issue of rights and responsibilities. And so those who collect the zakat have to have an understanding and tawsif an-nas, like who are the people, what is the descriptive of the people in the community. So you have to know the affairs of the people, right? And so that means you have to be engaged. As a leadership, you have to be engaged. It's not, again, there's a difference between leadership and management. Leadership has the ability to take vision and see how that vision can come about, but inspire people to be committed to them. Bring the best out of the people so they maintain that commitment. Management in this case, in our context, in our definition, as it pertains to our community, is just making sure that the building is maintained. Right? And people are pleased enough not to raise enough hell to overthrow their donations. That's basically what it means. Right? That's, evade the chaos. But that's not necessarily leadership. It becomes bad management even. And so when we start talking about the issue, of the leadership and understanding the reality of the community and how there's a commitment that's mitigating the 2 realities, the leadership existing and the whole issue of getting a commitment from the people to maintain the community and showing commitment to the community, like doing things which show that the leadership really cares. And so the leadership has to understand what's going on in the community. In the case study that we're talking about, like the case of single mothers, how many single mothers now we're seeing that they're in situations in which, first of all, they're alone. They're alone and they're prey to any brother of any caliber, whether Muslim or not Muslim. Many of them are alone. Sometimes without any support with their families, from their families, period. They're divorced or widowed or whatever it may be. And so you find that, you have a case study, a group of sisters, and the ideal vision of community. If we want to talk, everybody likes to look at Ortugal and, they hype up all of these concepts. But, if we look at the reality of the Muslim Ummah, okay, why isn't there a Baytul Mal? Why isn't there, again, we talk about the issue of zakat and we talk about the issue of sadaqah why isn't there, a collection of money which goes into a pool, and that the purpose of that money is for particular needs of the community which are understood? That's why we said knowing the reality of the community is important. If we have the understanding that zakat is an obligation, then we have to have an understanding of كيف نتصرف بها. And how is it that we're going to use it and put it to implementation? It's not just the issue of telling people you're obligated to pay the zakat, pay us the zakat. Now it's the issue of how do you use the zakat, right? And that's why we say leadership, it goes beyond just the issue of management or the issue of just claiming to be in charge. The deen itself puts certain restrictions. These are not issues that are open to just somebody's ijtihad in that regard. Somebody's opinions that they have about how things should maneuver. Vision of community, what community is, the outlines and the boundaries, and the identifiers of all of that can be found in our understanding in the deen itself. Not just from the issue of fiqh, our understanding, meaning in the collections of teachings which we have inherited for 1400 years. What do Muslim collectives, communities look like? Right? And so then, in the case of these single mothers, one of the most healthiest things to see is that these sisters are taken care of from that regard. And then there's another issue from the angle of leadership, which is the issue of wilayah, the issue of the wali. Because in many cases, what we see is that these types of sisters really have no wali. And some of them have been born Muslim into Muslim families. But the wali may be physically present but not active. Or the wali may not even exist. And the same issue with the converts. And so then it would seem that the masjid will fulfill this role. And some imams do that. But it's not clear what the situation is. It's not clear what the responsibilities are. It's not made part of the vision so that it's readable by the people. To the point even where, and I mentioned this in another talk, where there's conflict of interest principles that are put in place. Like there's a signing of a conflict of interest statement in this regard. Like one of the conflict of interest issues that comes to the fore is a wali marrying the sister that is under his wilayah. And we mentioned this in the other talk that we did on marriage and so on and so forth. The radical reconstruction of marriage. And, on one of the Facebook lives. And one of the things is that if we, لو نأخذ بمفهوم الولاية في الشريعة, نتصور الأمر على خلاف ما هو الآن. And that's the reality. If we take the conceptualization, the understanding of wilayah in the Sharia, we will never have an understanding that the wali marries his own daughter. Because that's initially the wali is the father or the uncle or the brother. And so whoever steps in to be the wali because those people are not there. And so then in the Islamic fiqh, the so-called leadership, even though it's supposed to be the political leadership, but that's absent. So it comes back to the issue of the leadership in the masjid. And so then the leadership in the masjid should have that clear where, there is protection that takes place. That's just one case. We take one case study, the issue of single mothers, and it has twofold realities to it. One is the issue of the making sure that these sisters have enough to maintain themselves because they become the vulnerables in the community. Some of them condemned forever to an eternity because they got divorced or they're widowed in some cultures. That's how it operates, which is un-Islamic, but it's a reality of where things are at. And then the other side of, who is there to look after the well-being? And then if something happens when we start talking about building community, knowing that these sisters may be available for marriage. So how do you mitigate that? And so then that's the issue of having sound leadership in the masjid, that the leadership will know that these sisters exist and these youth that are in these families who are going to need mentors. I don't like using the word mentors, but eldership, or people that are standing that can guide them. So that's an issue, the issue of the economics, the issue of guidance, and then the issue of protection. If we have sound vision in the community, that becomes part of what the community does. The other issue is youth, and I touched upon it briefly in that example. That if we look at the case study of youth and we study the reality of the community and we look at the vision of where communities are at and where the situation of the youth is at, there's a disconnect, a real disconnect in many masajid. Because again, we're of the model of the presumption that the masjid is the center of the Muslim community. Some people have moved beyond that model. They're on something else because they failed at the masjid model, right? They don't have the masjid model intact, so they moved on to other models. Or there's a necessity for other models, of how you do outreach in the Muslim community. But in the Sunnah, the centrality is the masjid. Now, if there's centers and so on and so forth, those centers are set out with particular reasons, right? Those reasons become the focus of why that community exists in that way. And sometimes it may be because another space is created outside of the masjid, right? And by default, because the Muslims exist and they have practice, then other things may take place in that center, like the salah or this or that. But the original intention may not have been a masjid. It may be for some other reasons. And we find that has become popular in today's time. Or I'm an advocate of even saying centers that don't have anything directly to do with Islam, but are indirectly influenced by the values of Islam for people that are extremely far from Islam, right? And some people, that's a different discussion, but that's something that's an idea that's there, that, you have outreach places or outreach posts to people that feel as though they're so far from the deen, but they need something similar. And sometimes that works out in different ways. Like I know a brother who has a coffee shop, and his coffee shop operates like that. His coffee shop operates for a meeting place for the Muslims, and that's a place where sometimes the Muslims, they go and they take their problems, or they go and they meet other people there. And those people, when they meet them and they interact with them, there's Islamic teachings that are being communicated, but it doesn't feel the same as some sort of community center, or it doesn't feel the same as a masjid. But that's another type of conversation. Going back to the point of the issue of the case study of the youth, the vision, and the commitment. We've been talking about the commitment of the leadership to the community itself. And so, for instance, when it comes to the issue of the youth, there's a necessity to be committed to the point of understanding what's going on, so that disconnect between the masjid and the youth doesn't exist. But if we're not open to being informed as to what is the case and what is going on and creating a space, this is another issue when we talk about the issue of leadership versus management. Because you have a lot of micromanagers. They micromanage the imam. They micromanage the community. They micromanage the youth in that community. They micromanage everything, as though the community is the manifestation of the power of their egos. That becomes extremely problematic and reckless. And so the issue of the community being obligated, in this case we're talking about the leadership and the masjid, to the youth, the first stage becomes that of breaking or bridging the gap, breaking the distance, bridging the gap, becoming familiar, becoming aware. If that's not there between the vision and the leadership and what's going on the ground with the youth, don't expect for there to even be continuity of that community. Because communities that can't reproduce themselves or can't maintain the concept of longevity, how are you going to achieve that? What is the succession plan? And we just made a Facebook Live on the issue of succession plans and where are we going in the future. Because the vision is not sound, we haven't built people that will be able to maintain the masjid and carry it. The masjid becomes a one-generation issue, and then it begins to fade out when it comes to the issue of donations and when it comes to the issue of bodies, because of the way that the masjid interacts with the community itself. And so then that brings us to the other side, the side of the commitment of the people to the leadership in the masjid. So we talk about sometimes when there's failures of the community leadership to commit to the community itself, there's issues that erupt in that. People become distant from the masjid. They don't have the masjid as central in their lives. Or some of these other organizations, as we mentioned, but we start off with the masjid, huwa ashraf makan. So that's the issue that comes up. Now there's the other fold. There's a twofold process here. There's a commitment of the leadership to the community, guided by a vision, and then there's the issue of the commitment of the people to the leadership. And so getting the commitment of the leadership to the people, like for instance, in a case study of the single mothers, of course, if you're taking care of their situations, they're going to have some sort of commitment, right? They're going to be somewhat committed to the community. And it's the same thing of the youth, right? But also we have to educate people, and I want to end on this note. We have to educate people on the responsibility that we have to the idea of community and the idea of masjid, and everything that comes after that, right? In according to need. And that's not going to happen if we don't have a solid understanding. And this is why we said, when we talk about the Muslim personality, the first thing that the masjid is obligated to do is to teach the people these realities of how to move forward and how to understand these things. But if you don't have a leadership which is properly grounded, you're never going to have a vision that is able to pull the people out of their conditions, right? And if you don't have interested, vested leadership in the community itself, it's always going to be disconnected, and it's going to take the easier route, which is the route of just managing the building versus leading in the community or taking the leadership role. And the best example for that of what a leader is the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and then thereafter the companions, and then thereafter the ulama. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.